Hey guys, what's going on? Dan here again. So, diving into the next video, we're going to talk about intensity. So, if you watch the other ones, we've talked about volume, we talked about frequency, we're going to talk about a whole bunch of stuff in this training one. I know it's a lot of information, but it's really important that you have a pretty good understanding. Don't worry if it flies over your head. Again, I'm trying my best to just explain it as simple as I can. And then you can always read the ebook later on, which kind of ties a few things in again. And just puts it into perspective further. So, how hard should I be training to see results? This is a big one. It's probably one of the biggest ones that is going to impact your goals, if I'm honest. Volume is going to be a big one as well, but intensity is kind of the bread and butter of training. Okay, if you don't train hard enough but you train often, you're probably not going to see that great results. But if you train hard enough and you train even slightly less than you did before, you're probably going to see better results. Okay, because it doesn't really take that much when you're first starting off to see results, like I mentioned before. But obviously, as the more experience you gather over time as advanced and intermediate lifters, then intensity is even more important, as you're going to have to really kind of track. So, like I said before, we need to track everything, right? Data is king, especially when it comes to workouts, but even with nutrition and the rest, data is king. So how hard should you be training? Well, the answer is you need to work hard enough to stimulate your body and force it to adapt, right? Essentially what happens is our body always wants to be balanced, okay? So another way of saying that is homeostasis. So our body always wants to stay the way it is. So when you get hotter, you start sweating, right? You want more water. You want to do all these things to kind of help your body get cooler, right? You're not going to start wearing a jacket and start kind of bundling up. You do the opposite, right? When you start training, your body's basically saying, holy shit, what's happening? Why am I getting this added stress to my body? Why am I having to lift all this heavy stuff or run this extra mile or whatever? And it's going to slowly start adapting so that the next workout is ready and it's kind of going to fire and be in a better position to handle that load, right? And that's kind of what we do. And then eventually what we do is we give ourselves a bit of time off before we dive back into the training, right? So what does that look like in terms of intensity? Well, we can measure it in different ways, or we can use different approaches. So the first one is RPE, which is called rate of perceived exertions. We're going to dive into that. The other one is called RIR, which is called reps in reserve. Those two work in conjunction quite often, or at least I do use those together quite often. You can use percentages, right? So let's say I'm going to do 75% of my 1 rep max on my squat or 75% of my 1 rep max on my bench, right? So that's another way. You can just train to failure, right? So you just train every single time, kind of like balls to the wall. You just don't stop, which has its pros and its cons. So like I wrote down, it can hurt your recovery because naturally, if I'm going to be doing every workout like it's my last and I'm training to failure, evidence suggests that it's going to actually probably hinder you slightly because your body's having to spend more time recovering because it's always in this holy shit mode, right? Whereas if I always kind of leave 1 or 2 reps left in the tank, the intensity is not that much more of a difference and it's going to help me recover because it's got less metabolic damage, less metabolic stress, and all these fancy words to say that basically your body's like, oh my God, like there's a lot going on internally for me to sort out right now. Okay. So that's what it looks like. So what is RP? So RP is a scale of 1 to 10. So 1 is like you're laying in bed watching Netflix chilling. 10 is like, oh my God, like you're screaming for your mom, you're screaming for your dad. You're like, get me out of the hole. I can't get out. And that means like you're at the bottom of your squat and you've got like 5 guys trying to lift the weight off your back because you physically can't move. That's 10. Right? So that's physical failure. Technical failure is another way of looking at it. So let's say, for example, you're doing a bench press and your technique's really good, but then towards the end, you're starting to roll your shoulders or really pop your shoulders forward. You're losing that integrity in your back. Well, that would be an example of technical failure. So you might want to stop there too. Okay. So you physically can't get up or you physically can't perform the exercise properly. And I would say try to get in the habit of making sure that the technical aspect of the lift is always bang on. And if it's getting too heavy or you're getting too tired and you start noticing it, that's your technical failure, okay? One thing we know is that beginners are really bad at identifying where they are on the scale versus intermediate to advanced lifters, all right? So this has been shown in studies where, like, let's say, for example, I had 2 of me again. One of me was a beginner and, I am where I am now, more intermediate lifter. If I was to do a 100 kilo squat on my back and the beginner was to do a 100 kilo squat, let's say we had the same strength, the guy who's a beginner would probably think it's a lot harder, a lot sooner. Whereas because I've got more experience, because I've lifted that weight before, and I've kind of I've done my time in the gym, I'm probably going to be much more accurate in saying, well, that's an 8 out of 10 or a 7 out of 10. Whereas I guarantee you the beginner's going to go, that was a 10 out of 10, that was a 9 out of 10, and they won't budge, right? And that's what I see with a lot of clients that I've worked with in the past, where I ask them mid-set, I'll say, where are you 1 to 10? They'll go 7. So that means, and you'll see in a second, they might not have that many more reps left in the tank, but then they'll go on and they'll pump out another 15 or 20, right? So they don't really have that awareness yet. And the best way to get better is by videotaping yourself. So if you could, videotape yourself doing the exercise and ask yourself how easy that looked. And if there's if your legs aren't shaking, your arms aren't shaking, like your shoulders or whatever, then you pretty much know you're not close to failure. You could probably pump out another few reps, okay? As a beginner, you could probably see results by focusing on an RPE 5 at a minimum, and then, increasing that over time. So an RPE 5 would mean, you finish your sets and you're saying, okay, that was a 5 out of 10. Right? And I'll show you what another really good way is of kind of calculating that, or I guess kind of being self-aware of how difficult that is, by using reps in reserve. So again, if you're doing RPE 5, 6s, 7, 8s, 9s, and 10s, you're probably going to see results as a beginner. If you're somebody who's kind of more intermediate or advanced, then you're probably going to stay around 6s, 7, 8s, and 9s and 10s, but you're going to dive into your 7s and your 8s and your 9s more often, okay? So for most, I'd suggest focus on a 6 to a 9 RPE level at times when you can, you can even train to a 10 out of 10 failure if you want to, but like I said, it's just going to hurt your recovery time, and you're better off just keeping 1 or 2 reps left in the tank, which is what we're going to talk about next. So RPE 6 to 9, think, how difficult was that? 1 to 10. If you're at least at a 5, 6 as a beginner, you're okay. And if you're more intermediate, you need to push it, okay? So what's reps and reserves? So it's a similar scale that we kind of use in conjunction, but what we do is we say, how many reps left do you have in the tank? So simply you state how many reps you could have done more, okay? So for example, if I have 100 kilos on my back and I'm doing squats, I do 10 reps, and then I tell my coach, I probably could have done another 5. Well, that means that I was, reps in reserve, I had 5 left in the tank, right? But this would also mean from an RPE perspective, all you would do is say, okay, if 10 out of 10 is the hardest I can go RPE, I'm going to take 10, take out my 5, so subtract 5, which means that what I have left, is an RPE 5, which would be my rate of perceived exertion. So basically, just to make that sound more simple, if I said I had 5 reps left in the tank, I'm basically saying my RPE is 5, because 5 plus 5 is 10. Can't speak for some reason, right? As another example, if I was to say, okay, I can do 16 push-ups. So I do 16 push-ups towards my 15th and 16th rep. Like my arms are shaking. I can barely get off the ground. I tell my coach, I probably had 1 more left in the tank, but I physically probably couldn't have got off the ground again. Then I know that means that my RPE is 9, right? Because like I said, 1 plus 9 is 10, right? So I just subtract my 10 out of 10 scale by my reps in reserve, which is what I told my coach. So 10 minus 1 equals 9, and that's your RPE. So that's a really good way of using both together, okay? Because if I said, as an example, I asked you after doing a really difficult set, how many reps do you have left in the tank? And you said 5, but then throughout the set, I was saying, okay, what's your RPE? And you say 7. Well, there's something going on there, right? It's not the same numbers. But if you do a set and towards the end, I say, what was your RPE? And you say 8. I go, okay, how many more reps left in the tank that you've done? And you say 2. Well, I know that's bang on, right? Because 2 plus 8 is 10, and that's my RPE. Make sense? So pretty straightforward. Basically, just think RPE, reps, and reserves. You can use them together, okay? So again, if you're going to be using the reps and reserve method on its own, then you always want to make sure you got 3 or maybe 4 reps left in the tank max, right? If you're a beginner, you can get away with 5, but for most of you, think 4, 3, 2, 1, or none is where you want to be, okay? So if you do a set of push-ups and you can do another 6, that's too easy. If you can do 7, way too easy. If you can do 8 more, way too easy. You got to bump up the intensity, all right? How do I use percentages? So we're going to touch base on this just quickly. It's not massive kind of prerequisite for you guys to use in your programs, in my opinion. You can just use RPE and reps and reserves and just track your weights accordingly. And then over time, you'll see that kind of probably makes sense because it'll get easier. You'll be lifting more weight, and then you'll realize that you're lifting more weight for the same RPE and everything like that, okay? But percentage can be used for any exercise and very popular in the strength realm. In order to use this method, you must test your exercise to find a rough estimate of your 1 rep max, or 1 RM. So the best way to do that is, in my opinion, if you're beginner, intermediate, even advanced, potentially advanced, obviously you have more experience doing this, but intermediate to beginners, is just try to maybe do like a 5 rep max or 3 rep max at most. Because again, most of the time you haven't mastered your form yet. So you don't want to start lifting crazy heavy weight and then you've never put, your 1 rep max on your back and you start shitting yourself basically. And it's happened to me before, so I know how that feels. So you would maybe do 3 rep max. So finding how much weight you can lift at most for 3 repetitions. And then you can roughly estimate and say, okay, I can do maybe another 5-10% of that on top of it. Okay. 100% equals RPE 10, 90% equals RPE 9, 88, 75, 7.5, and so on. So again, just an easy way of you saying, okay, well, if I was to go 75%, so if you do a program, it says do 75% of your 1 rep max, just say, okay, that's going to be 7.5 RPE. So I should only have 2.5 reps left in the tank, right? 2.5 plus 7.5 equals 10. Makes sense? So I'd only recommend doing your 1 rep maxes or 3 rep maxes or 5 rep maxes on your squats, your deadlifts, your bench, your rows, pull-ups, dips, and any kind of machines like your leg presses or your bench press machines and all those kind of things that are compound movements. You wouldn't want to be doing a 1 rep max on like, isolation exercise like a bicep curl or a pec fly or anything that's going to kind of maybe like compromise the stability of that joint or really put it under a lot of pressure and kind of stress is probably the last thing you want to do. Okay. So hopefully that makes sense. We're going to start tying all this in together. So to summarize, how hard should you be training? Hard enough to get an adaptation or to stimulate adaptation. So for you, think RPE, 1 to 10 scale. You want to be at least at a 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. If you're a beginner, you can probably get away with 5. For the rest of us, aim 6 to 10. You don't want to be training to failure all the time because it makes recovery a lot harder, and it's been shown that you can get just as good results by doing 1 to 2 reps less, right? So having 1 to 2 reps left in the tank, so an RPE 8 or 9. And then, basically RPE 1 to 10 scale, reps in reserve, just say how many reps do I have left in the tank, and then that should help you identify your RPE as well, just like we talked about. And then percentages, you can, again, just correlate that to your RPE. You can test them out if you want to, but just make sure that your form's on point. Technically, that you have spotters around you so you don't hurt yourself. But again, probably not mandatory and necessary unless you're kind of, diving into the realms of like powerlifting and strength lifting and all that kind of stuff. So hopefully that makes sense. A little bit longer video, but it's important that we cover all this stuff, guys. And let's start piecing it all together. See you in a bit.